Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this webinar run by Pedersen Public Affairs in Brussels, but kindly sponsored by the International Oil and Gas Association. It's the IOGP. François-Régis, would you like to say a few words of welcome, please?
Sure, thank you very much, Peter. Yes, this name is very difficult to say, IOGP, I agree with you. And thanks to the Pedersen staff for hosting this webinar series. For us, it's a real pleasure to sponsor this discussion on carbon management as IOGP. And as I said last time, it's a topic that really deserves more attention and opens up new perspective, especially in the view to reach climate neutrality. I want to thank all participants for joining the webinar today, and special thanks to our speaker for making themselves available. A special one to Mrs. Spyraki to join us, although as she told me yesterday, it was a crazy busy day for her. So thanks a lot. And in the meantime, I look forward to the exchange between William and it's a great pleasure to have you both. Fundamental issue. Fundamental, I think the right word. Success on the climate front relies on fundamentals, in particular economic ones. These days, the fundamentals are shaken, to say the least, and the long-lasting economic impact of the COVID crisis remains to be discovered. One can only hope it won't be as grave as the health impact, hopefully. But when I look at our existing outlooks, forecast models, our ability to reduce emissions, to invest in new technology, to deliver energy, I feel like everything we had planned for is up in the air now. Are the fundamentals still there? Or are we walking blind? Will COVID make it even more difficult? And will it actually be an accelerator of our collective efforts? I really look forward to hearing our speakers' views on all this. As I mentioned last time as well, as the Oil and Gas Producer Association, we support the use of climate neutrality by 2050. While we all know that absolute zero emissions is not a feasible option, an objective, climate neutrality is an incredibly The first thing we must do is to realize that we absolutely must use all solutions at our disposal. We cannot be picky. We cannot restrict our options by dogmatism and put all our weight and eggs on a few technologies only unless it's bound to fail and it's bound to be expensive. So let's say we go 80–90% of the way. The last stretch in emission reduction was never going to be easy. This is where carbon management is interesting because it can open up the rest of the road. As oil and gas producers, you know we work on solutions such as CCS, but also afforestation, hydrogen, and even direct air capture. There are many other creative solutions out there. The question is, will carbon management have an even bigger role now after COVID, or will that role be much smaller? What are the model's answers on the share of emission reductions it can actually deliver? These are all questions, Peter, that I ask myself perhaps more than before. So I really look forward to this discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, François-Régis, for those the introductory words. Now, as I introduce the speakers, we've got a fantastic panel today. But as I do that, don't be surprised if you see a poll appear that will be asking a question that I would invite you to reply to as soon as you see the question. It's a very simple, straightforward question, actually, but it's a simple question, but the answer's complicated, if you like the full answer. So, Joanna, if you would be so kind as to put the poll on the screen. Now, I'm going to introduce Maria Spyraki as the member of the European Parliament who's kindly joined us for this discussion. She is a member of the ITRA, the Industry, Research and Energy Committee of the European Parliament. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. Then we also have Laszlo Varro, who is the chief economist of the International Energy Agency in Paris. Thank you for joining us, Laszlo. I first met Laszlo many years ago when he worked for an energy company, MOL, but he's had a fantastic career since, and so we're very honored to have him. And William Zimmern is from the macroeconomic team of BP. from BP, and he's in charge of the BP Energy Outlook, among other things. So, William, thank you very much indeed for joining us from BP. So the poll question is on, so please do give in a reply. It's the question essentially is the one that I would put to the speakers first, and perhaps, William, you could kick us off. I don't know whether you can see the results, William, if you're looking, but I'll tell you that so far people are thinking that the question is, given the economic impacts of the coronavirus, is reaching the EU's climate target in 2030 going to be less costly, more costly, or will there be no impact? And most people are saying it's going to be more costly, although the indications I've heard is that coronavirus is actually reducing the emissions of the EU by a few percentage points, certainly for this year. So if we're reducing emissions already, perhaps one might expect that it's going to be easier to be more ambitious. William, would you like to kick us off and give us a quick take on what you think?
Okay.
2030, is it going to be harder or easier?
Okay. Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. It's a great honor. I'm going to be a typical economist and not give you a definitive answer. I mean, I think I'll start by saying we are in the midst of a crisis here. And actually, it's really difficult to come up with objective views sort of when you're in the middle of something. I think, you know, the range of uncertainty is enormous. I would say it's less than it was 3 months ago. I think we're getting a better handle on what's going on and the shape of what a recovery might look like. But the reality is, you know, I think who knows, and we, you know, the risk of a second wave and a risk of further lockdowns is going to complicate things enormously. The way I think about this is fundamentally this is a health shock that has turned into a very large economic shock, you know, the largest since the Great Depression. IMF think it's $12 trillion over the next 2 years that the global economy has lost. You know, that's of a global economy of about 70 trillion. So it's an enormous wealth shock. And so on the face of it, you could say, okay, there's a wealth shock, so there's less resources available to commit to projects like the energy transition or climate change, where you have to invest today to reap benefits in the future. So from that point of view, it sounds, you know, it sounds like it's bad, and it sounds like it's going to slow some of the targets or what we hope to achieve within Europe. There are some reasons to be more positive, though. I think this crisis has shown a heightened awareness of the fragility of the planet. I think it's shown that you know, global crises of this type, they don't respect national borders. You know, I think you know, that there are global issues which need global solutions. I think I've been encouraged by the commitment to sort of build back better. You know, people, especially in the European Union, are committed to these stimulus packages. They're committed to attaching a green, or making sure that these stimulus packages have some sort of green association with them. And I think that's really important. So I think that's very positive. I mean, and I think from my point of view, the other thing is that with these lockdowns, we've shown that with the governments and policies, with permission of society, can have huge effects, and it can have huge effects really quickly. So we've actually seen the power of government and the power of policy, if it comes with society, that you can actually affect enormous change. So from that point of view, I'm positive, and I think we at BP, we think this could be really positive. This could be something that spurs the world into action. So I'm going to say, sort of mildly, I think this could be a positive thing. Maybe not 2030, but maybe beyond that, because it starts something more important.
Okay, well, thank you very much, William. Before I come to Maria, because you're going to be a politician, making it sort of more EU relevant, but Laszlo, perhaps still on the modeling, is what would you say the COVID effect is going to be on climate ambition?
So the IEA Global Energy Review estimated that the coronavirus crisis brings down global carbon dioxide emissions by around 2.6 billion tons in 2020. Now, this is a historically unprecedented decline, but what is slightly frightening is that in the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario, which is essentially the mathematical representation of the Paris Agreement, global carbon dioxide emissions by 2025, only 5 years from now, are lower than today. And next time, we will want to achieve that without shutting down the global economy. So the climate challenge is very much with us, but the investment challenge is very much with us. Now, if I look at how the economics of decarbonization changed, first of all, I start with the good news. Major central banks, including the European central banks, reacted with a massive scale monetary expansion and quantitative easing. So Europe is going to have ultra-low interest rates, essentially negative interest rates, for quite a long time. The energy transition overall pushes the energy system in a more capital-intensive direction.
Yeah.
Because we are putting in place initial capital investment into retrofitting buildings, putting up wind turbines, buying electric cars, and save on the operating costs of the fossil fuel-based system. So ultra-low interest rates are a fantastic opportunity. Now, they are not a gift from God. There is a need for a proper policy design. The regulatory frameworks will have to be there. The European Investment Bank will have to be very active. But there is a major opportunity from the overall macroeconomic environment. I would also, on the other hand, caution that European energy and climate policy puts the transformation of the building sector to the center of the strategy, and I think that's the right choice. But that's in practice natural gas. Now, natural gas markets globally were oversupplied even before the virus crisis. With the demand shock of the virus crisis, European gas markets became a battle for survival between Gazprom and the American exporters, leading to ultra-low gas prices, and they don't see any change of that in the foreseeable future. So this relentless flood of dirt cheap gas is going to be a major economic headwind. So I think this European strategy focus on the building sector, this will have to be coupled with a really well-designed efficiency policy and a large-scale mobilization of financial resources. And I think that another major challenge is that before the virus, I would have argued that a significant expansion of public transport and also railways replacing transport aviation and cars is a very cost-efficient way of moving towards the decarbonization of the transport sector. Unfortunately, there are clear indications from all across Europe that people became reluctant to use public transport. The traffic jams in the major cities returned much more rapidly than the recovery of GDP, while public transport ridership is still very low. So I think there is a possibility that this is a permanent change in social attitudes, and that will require a different and possibly more expensive approach to the transport sector.
Well, yes. So it's amazingly how complicated all of this is. Maria, perhaps we could just ask if essentially the COVID is going to help the European Green Deal or not. Is that, in the end, it boils down to that rather simple question: is it going to derail the European Green Deal even?
It's simple, and it's yes. And allow me to say that I think that now we have the final word concerning the implementation of the Green Deal. And we have to understand that the Green Deal is here to stay in terms of becoming the roadmap, not only for the MFF, for the next MFF, but also for the recovery fund. And in this regard, it is important to explain to the people that it is time to rebuild our economies better and to use all the available instruments that we have in order to facilitate tackling climate change, in order to upgrade our quality of life, in order to facilitate the industry for being greener and more circular. In this regard, I think that we have to join forces, and at the same time, we have to join funding, and it is important that we hear from the experts that we need much more funding, much more than the next MFF, and also the money that the European Union will raise from the market with the recovery funded by issuing bonds, I hope, by the beginning of the autumn. But in this regard, we need also to join forces from EIB, from the commercial banks, and also to use the instruments that they can support and provide greener investments, and they mean taxonomy, and they mean also the green and blue hydrogen. I prefer the green one, and I would like to insist on the issue of the infrastructure that we have to use, because it is important to know how can we go ahead by upgrading the existing gas infrastructure, and also to open the discussion how can we facilitate and enable the industry in order to have less CO2 emissions and greenhouse emissions in the air. And in this regard, I would like to put on the table the issues that it comes when it comes to the CCS and to the CCU, because you know that we have a directive which is not in the plan to be revised, but at the same time we have to step up. We have to step up in terms of funding. We have to step up in terms of the legislative framework. We have to step up in terms of reducing burdens, and one of them is the way that we can transmit and we can transport CO2.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mrs. Spyraki. What about the 55% target that President von der Leyen has mentioned? I mean, this is going to certainly step up climate ambition in Europe, and the regulatory framework will have to be strengthened as well. Are you in favor of the 55 or the 65 even that's been mentioned by the rapporteur in the Envy committee, or would you be more modest in your ambitions?
I think that we need impact assessment, and this is the position of my party, as you already know, because it is important to understand that when we make a step forward, we have to take into account the impact that these steps create. And of course, we need impact assessment for all levels. I'm fully in favor of including maritime sector or aviation sector or both in the ETS system. I'm also in favor to include CCS and CCU in the ETS system by facilitating the technology. But it is important to have impact assessment for every and each sector. It is essential.
That's a great reply. To me, that tells you why we're doing a webinar right now on economic modeling, because you and the Commission are essentially doing an economic modeling exercise, an impact assessment, in order to inform themselves what percentage we should set as a 2030 goal. So economic modeling is absolutely at the heart, because everyone's waiting for it. But let me go back to the modelers and ask them whether they think economic modeling gives clarity on where the ambition level should be set. What would you say, William?
I think models can help. Look, let's be honest here. Models will never have the right answer. Models are a tool that we use as policymakers to make decisions. And I think the principles that I use when I model is, I think you've got to understand the range of uncertainties. You've got to understand if you assume something, you get a certain outcome, and then if you assume something else, you get a different outcome. And I think using models to actually try and understand some of the differences between two states of the world, I think is most important. I think using models to expect to create an accurate forecast, I don't think that is helpful. And therefore, sort of the question that Maria is asking at the moment, which is what should our targets be in 2030, and how much could that cost in different states of the world? I think models, or sort of these big integrated assessment models and economic impact models, can be quite useful to answer that question. But we have to be realistic. They're not going to give you the whole answer. That will be one input into a range of other inputs that help policymakers make decisions. So,
Laszlo, would you concur with that view?
Yeah, so I would quote General Eisenhower, who, after the Normandy invasion, remarked that in his experience, plans are useless, but planning is essential. And I think this is useful for long-term energy models as well. The objective is not to predict the future. The objective is to outline certain choices for policymakers in the energy system. Now, I also have to say that in the European context, very often we get into a bit of a circular argument. because there is a very clear consensus from the modeling community that an ambitious decarbonization strategy for Europe would be macroeconomically beneficial. Because with a bit of a simplification, this is a continent which imports the overwhelming majority of fossil fuels. So there is no real domestic economic activity associated with fossil fuel production. In an ambitious energy transition trajectory, we would import Chinese solar panels, but apart from the Chinese solar panels, Europe has a very strong industrial capability in most of the clean energy technologies. So we're essentially switching from Saudi oil and Russian gas to made in Germany wind turbines and Hungarian carpenters and plumbers retrofitting buildings all across Europe. And it's reasonably easy to show under a broad range of conditions that would be macroeconomically positive for the European economy. But I would also have to say that the same economic models also highlight quite important obstacles which are not economic in their nature, but social and political. Now, increasing the retrofit rate of the European building sector by a factor of 3 is not only a problem of money. It's also the problem of overcoming contractual structures, licensing authorities, local municipalities, and so on. Doubling the rate of deployment in wind and solar in Europe is not only the issue of money, it's also land use regulation, social acceptance, and so on. So I think probably the summary message from the economic analyst community to the political decision makers would be that yes, it is going to be macroeconomically beneficial, but only if the political decision makers also do their job and remove the political obstacles from the transition.
So I come back to you, Maria Spyraki. What would you say this tells you? If the economic modeling that the Commission is doing is going to allow for the scenarios to be published, it's still going to leave with some difficult political choices.
Yes,
isn't it not?
We are ready to do them, but it is important to understand that when we are doing a political choice, we are not taking some kind of fruits from a basket. We have the responsibility to go ahead with significant choices, and one of them, as Laszlo mentioned, is the renovation wave in terms of the Green Deal, and it is also in terms of the Recovery Fund. Allow me to speak for myself, because it is important to remind that I am the rapporteur on behalf of ENVI Committee on the renovation wave, on the INI report of the renovation wave. And according to the numbers, according to the data that we have available, buildings represent 40% of our energy consumption in the EU, and at the same time represents almost 36% of greenhouse emissions. And we will have the same buildings, approximately 75%, until 2050. So we have to upgrade them, and we have to renovate them, not only because we have to reduce CO2 emission and to reduce also the energy consumption, but because we have to upgrade the quality of life of the people living in. This kind of political choice has a direct social impact. It concerns not only the quality of air, it concerns not only the quality of the everyday life of the people. It is also concerns the social spending and a lot of other issues. That's why I think that we have to understand that when we make a choice, we have to combine it with other choice in order to have the best outcome, the best result. In this regard, I think that we have to coordinate actions concerning not only the social economy, but also the industry, but also the way that we can create jobs and growth. And in this regard, it is, for example, important to ask the Commission to have a kind of building passport in order to promote circular constructive elements for renovation. It is important it is important to promote circular economy in terms of action plan 2. And at the same time, it is important to reduce CO2 emission. How? Not only by reconstructing buildings and by upgrading buildings, but also by facilitating the industry to reduce CO2 emission. Because now we have on the paper and in our industrial strategy, we are discussing on how can we facilitate the industry to become electrified. But it's not easy. It's not easy.
No,
And a lot
definitely not.
of CO2 emissions are coming from the industry. So it is important to have, allow me to say, realistic solutions.
Yeah, but industry, of course, does need some degree of predictability. They need to know the direction of travel. I mean, 40%, the EU is not on track at the moment with the policies and measures we have.
Mm-hmm.
The EU would not be on track to meet the 40% reduction target in 2030. The European Environment Agency say this. By raising the bar of ambition to 50 or 55%, we're going to need to have more stringent policies. And so to some extent, it seems to me that the industry is waiting to know what we're going to do. And so far, the Commission has made a Green Deal communication, a circular economy action plan, an industrial strategy, but these are all communications in large part. And we need to be looking at the legislation that's going to come, which isn't yet published. The only bit we've got is the climate law, which commits to climate neutrality in 2050. And then in September, they're going to add the 2030 target. So in a way, that's the first thing. It's the first legislation is setting out the targets. And then the Commission needs to revise a lot of legislation and implement the strategies they've got by either legislative action or funding. And I think this is going to be a very, very full and complex agenda. But I did note from Laszlo a very interesting thing, and that is the low price of gas is one of the consequences right now of the economic situation. So I wonder what that means for coal. I think it's going to be, is it not going to be bad news for coal? I go back to you, Laszlo, and then perhaps to William. In the terms of the energy mix, are we going to use more gas?
So basically, this ultra low price of gas, this goes directly to the building sector and will need to be overcome by efficiency policies. Then it goes to the electricity sector, and it's a major contributor to extremely low wholesale electricity prices. Now, those extremely low wholesale electricity prices, you're absolutely right, they accelerate the phase out of old coal plants, both in Europe and also in the United States. So in fact, we think that in Europe and the United States, coal is definitely on its way out. But these ultra low wholesale electricity prices are also incredibly painful for the old workhorse of low carbon production, which is the existing nuclear fleet.
Existing nuclear, right? Yeah.
So we might well have a faster than expected decline of coal both in Europe and the United States, but we might well also have a faster than expected decline of nuclear power in both Europe and the United States. So we lose high carbon and we lose low carbon generation as well. It's a double.
Yeah, that's complicated, isn't it? But it would suggest that renewables, electricity, from which we can perhaps make green hydrogen, is something that we could perhaps all support more of. So one would expect there to be more policies to promote renewable electricity. The next phase of our discussion is going to come on to the discussions about the technologies on which we've got a question. But before that, William, would you like to talk about the energy mix and this low price of gas, perhaps the low price of oil as well?
Yeah. I mean, I think to build on Laszlo's point, we've got to be aware of unanticipated consequences. So if we have very low gas prices for a number of years, what we're actually seeing is that gas projects and gas LNG projects are not getting agreed. So they're not happening. So we may have an excess of gas over the next few years with very low prices, but it does mean that actually gas sort of further down the line, which is going to be needed to decarbonize emerging markets sort of 2030s and beyond, it's actually could increase the price of that gas further out and therefore damage the transition sort of potentially outside Europe, sort of in the 2030s, 2040s. So you've got to beware, sort of think about sort of whole systems analysis and these knock-on consequences. And similarly with the sort of Build Back Better agenda, which is fantastic and absolutely sort of BP is behind it and pushing, there is a risk that we choose to build back using known existing green technologies. You know, we build back using solar, we build back using wind because they're proven, they create jobs, they can happen very quickly. But we don't want that to happen at the expense of the more difficult sort of ambitious energy transition projects, the CCU, the CCS, the hydrogen, whether it's green or blue, and sort of the research and the more difficult sort of unproven technologies that actually need to come online beyond 2030. So I think there is a balance to be had, and we've got to be careful that the world doesn't shift just thinking about green jobs and green growth at the expense of things further out.
Yeah, good, thank you. Would you like to say anything, Maria, before
Yes, I do.
take a question? Please, please.
Because I come from a country which has already announced that they will shut down the coal plants in Ptolemaida in West Macedonia and also in Megalopolis by 2023. So we are front runners in a way, but at the same time we are trying to bridge the power gap with gas and photovoltaics, and this is the first step. And the second one, of course, is how can we manage the issue of the people, because it is important no one left behind. And it is important to use all the available financing that comes from the EU and especially from Just Transition Fund. Yeah. So a lot of plans concerning hydrogen, for example, or concerning the production of batteries for electric vehicles are on the table, but until now we didn't see anything. And you can understand that maybe the danger that we face is that we will lose people in the gap, in the time gap that we create by doing everything very, very fast, by spending up all the changes in our energy mix that are needed.
Yeah, thank you. Joanna, are we receiving a question that can you tell us what the questions are, what one of them is, because we might have more than one.
We do have questions, and I also encourage in more. But before moving on, there's the questions on the technology side that I think is coming up. So before that, there is a question about the recovery. What about recovery for the EU industry, especially such as aviation sector? What solutions could you consider having long-term value and further the decarbonization?
Yeah, well, Maria, did you not mention the aviation sector
Yes.
and its inclusion into the emissions trading scheme? It's already covered by the emissions trading scheme to some extent.
In a way, yes. Yes, in a way, yes, but it is important to understand that now we are discussing the new ETS context, and it is important to have the coordinating manner, because we have also the maritime sector, and of course we have the global approach that we have to adapt, because it's not something that it is also within EU. It is something that it is affecting an industry that is now under crisis, and it's suffering from the consequences of the pandemic. And it's also an industry that it is under global pressure.
Yeah, it is. But I think it's very clear in the European Green Deal that maritime will be brought into the emissions trading scheme. That's what the Green Deal communication says anyway. Yes. And that the aviation element will be strengthened in some way or another. Any other questions, Joanna? Can you hear?
Yes. Should I maybe announce the next poll?
Yes, by all means. Let's ask, because we're transitioning now to a discussion about the technologies, which we've already begun to some extent. Joanna, you launch the poll, and then people can answer. And it's quite a simple, again, it's are you in favor of this or that? If the poll, yes, it's there. And the question is, which technological path takes us to climate neutrality in 2050? Do we let the market decide, or do we let policymakers pick technologies? And Maria, I'm looking at you because you've mentioned a few technologies. I think of hydrogen, I think of CCS. We're testing the mood of the room here, as it were, as to whether or not policymakers should, whether they can know which technologies to bet on, if you like. Because as the title of this webinar is about the economic modeling and betting on carbon management, one way of managing is to concentrate on those certain technologies. Now, before I ask for you to respond, I'll give you an idea where the feedback is on the poll. The poll puts well in advance the idea that markets should decide the best and most cost-efficient technologies. In other words, the poll seems to support technology neutrality, and there's 70% in favor of that, 71%, and there's 28% only for those picking of technologies. And the hydrogen strategy, if I'm not mistaken, is very nearly going to come out. So we're already down the road of picking technologies, are we not, Maria? And I'd be very interested to know from the Economist too, after you've spoken, whether or not their modeling also picks technology sometimes and simulates that. Maria?
Well, it is important to know that, well, we are very, very close to the strategy, to the hydrogen strategy. We are waiting from the Commission, the communication by the end of summer, maybe earlier, I suppose, and I hope. But, you know, it is important to understand that we are have fully respect on technology neutrality. And at the same time, also, we have the responsibility to create, to launch a regulatory framework, a legislative framework in terms of a locomotive framework in order to success and in order to meet the targets of the Green Deal. In this regard, it is important to know how can we produce efficient and enough quantities of green hydrogen. How can we do this? We have to create the proper legislative framework, and we have also to facilitate the companies that they would like to invest in this regard. It is also important. It is also important to clarify what is the green hydrogen. In terms of the Commission, we need a definition, and we need also a clarification concerning the role of the other types of hydrogen, like the blue hydrogen. The second question is: shall we construct and shall we finally create new infrastructure in order to transport the green hydrogen? Yeah. The answer is that it is too costly, and it is European taxpayers' money. So we need to have an answer concerning the existing infrastructure, and how can we upgrade them in order to use them in order to use them to transport the new mix that it will contain hydrogen, green hydrogen, more than 15%, which is now the safety limit in a way. These are questions, and of course the third question is: how can we facilitate the industry in order to start capturing CO2 emission?
I was going to,
How can we do this? Because we have now a technology which is not premature, it's mature, and I mean CCU and CCS are mature technologies. And we have
mature, they exist.
Mature in a way that we have a lot of applications. And of course the market will check the application and will finally choose which is the proper. But it's not the case. The case is that we have to create the framework in order to start investing in this regard, starting from the private sector, because there's the key.
Yeah, thank you. Now, my recollection of the modeling that was done in the European Union by the Commission for the long-term strategy that they published in 2018 did assume that by 2050 there would be quite a contribution by CCS technologies. So, and indeed, the EU has before tried to back CCS technologies and said that by about 2015 there would be 12 plants in the operation, and we haven't seen them materialize. So I'd like to ask William and Laszlo whether, Laszlo, perhaps you go first. In your modeling work, do you model different technologies? Do you have to do a little bit of technology picking when you do your scenarios?
So I'm going to risk being expelled from the Brotherhood of Economists because I very firmly believe that there is no way policymakers can avoid making strategic choices on technologies. We do, in fact, we do two types of modeling. In our energy technology perspectives, we run models with a pure single shadow price of carbon, pure technology optimization. But in the sustainable development scenario, it's not a pure optimizing pathway. For example, in the sustainable development scenario, we don't try to mathematically estimate the optimal share of nuclear power in Germany. Set manually to zero. So we simply accept the policy choice that was taken. I mentioned nuclear because in real life, that's the biggest technology choice. I mean, nuclear is by far the largest low-carbon energy source in Europe, significantly bigger than wind and solar combined. Now, whether a country would want to embark in an energy transition without nuclear, like Germany, or whether a country want to embark on energy transition by expanding nuclear, like the United Kingdom, I mean, that's not a market-based decision, let's face it. That's a high-level, either the answer is yes or the answer is no. That is always a high-level political decision. The nature of nuclear technology is such that there is no way that a high-level political decision can be avoided. So that's one of the reasons for my skepticism. And the other is the path dependency of the infrastructure and the innovation process. And just let's take the example of solar PV, which is currently the most revolutionary, most transformative clean energy technology probably. And solar PV is very often framed in the green media as a sudden, unexpected success. Okay, so people discuss in the green media of how unexpectedly rapid the growth of solar was. Now, solar panels were actually invented in 1957. And in the first 20 years, they were so ridiculously expensive, they were used only on spy satellites. And they were subject to a very patient primarily by the US government scientific labs. Then a handful of countries like Germany and Japan had multi-billion euro commitments to help the deployment. And by the time we arrived today we have a carbon price driven deployment of solar power in several European countries. But that was half a century and several $100 billion of innovation and deployment funding after. So this kind of I think this kind of path dependencies in infrastructure and innovation means that we don't think that it's possible for policymakers to avoid making strategic choices. Of course, carbon pricing is extremely important, and of course, use every political opportunity to reinforce and extend carbon pricing. But the idea that this would be a purely price-driven transition, I think that's just simply out of touch.
Okay, well, thank you. And I'm glad to turn to you, William, because you work for an energy company, an oil company, BP, that is seemingly now, is it going cool on fossil fuel? What's, because to some extent, this solar panel discussion that we've just had, renewables, is that BP's new business area or new business plan?
Well, just on that, and then I'd like to come back to the question on markets, if that's okay. But sure. Just on BP, so in February, we announced our new ambition that we were going to be a net zero company by 2050. And our strategic goals are completely orientating towards that. And that was sort of half of our ambition. The other half was BP will help the world achieve its net zero ambitions by 2050 or earlier. So it's for BP, and that BP will actually try and support the world getting there. So that's absolutely the direction we're taking, and that will be, you know, that's what we're spending our time thinking about at the moment. Is that going to involve solar and wind? Absolutely. Will it involve other technologies? Absolutely. So it will involve a mixture. And so that's why sort of I come back to this question about, should it be market-led, or should we allow policymakers or even companies to pick winners? I mean, it's no surprise, I'm an economist. I will say I would prefer it to be market-led. But that's if there aren't any obvious market failures, and we know within climate there's enormous market failures, and so you actually have to address those market failures in an appropriate way. And so, you know, we clearly think you need a carbon price. And so then the question that Maria asked is, how do you incentivize private companies to invest in CCUS projects at scale? The way to do it is you price carbon at a price that is going to incentivize it to happen, and there's a very clear policy mandate that doesn't change. So if we see that there is going to be a certain price of carbon in the future, and there is reasonable confidence that that will be the price going forward, then you will incentivize these projects, and private companies will start to get involved. But it is the policy uncertainty and pricing carbon at too low a level that means that we're not seeing it being scaled at the moment.
Right. Well, that's great as a sort of introductory to you, Maria, because the emissions trading scheme looks as if it's going to be amended next June as part of the delivery program for a higher ambition in 2020. Would you be okay with this? I mean, if the stringency of the ETS is increased, the carbon price will go up. What about industry in that?
Well, I think it is a little complicated to have an answer right now, but it is important to have, first of all, the impact assessment, secondly, the coordination of all involving sectors. And I mean, I have already mentioned maritime, aviation, and of course, the industry. And third, I would like to add to William's observation that it is important not only to have a stable legislative framework, but also to promote new ideas. For example, it is important to have pricing on CO2, especially when we are trying to support CCS and CCU, but at the same time, it is important to promote new ideas. For example, the CO2 that it is transporting through pipelines is eligible for ETS, but the CO2 which is transporting by ships, it's not eligible. So we have to promote new ideas. There is an idea coming from Norway, and we have to take these ideas into account in order to have a legislative framework that it is open, it is stable, and it is finally facilitating the industry to join us to succeed the targets, because this is the case.
And industry is, to some extent, it's in the ETS already, yes, but we don't want it. We don't want it to leave Europe, of course. That's part of the rationale for the Commission suggesting that a carbon border adjustment mechanism might be needed. But
yes.
We need to help industry innovate. That seems to be obvious, but it costs money. And making them pay more through carbon pricing isn't necessarily good. But if the funding of the EU can be focused towards helping industry, I imagine that's something everybody can rally round. But in the end, would that not be kind of choosing technologies through the funding mechanisms that are put in place? For me, we come back to this technological choices. What are you going to fund? I doubt we'll fund nuclear through the ETS, but it's quite likely we might want to fund emissions-free steel using hydrogen, for example, which is one area that's flagged in the industrial strategy. Or we might want carbon capture and storage to be expanded. It needs upfront funding, and I imagine that we should be doing more of that, because storage is a removal from the atmosphere of CO2 that would otherwise have gone into the atmosphere. So in the end, we're going to be coming back to those difficult political choices. So many of them. I can't believe how busy you're going to be in the Parliament, and indeed all of us will be in the coming years.
Peter, can I just add?
If I may, I would like just...
Yeah, Maria.
I would like just to say that maybe you have to take a look on our papers concerning industrial strategy, because it is now under procedure. It is not, we don't have the final, we have just the drafts, but first it is the one sensitive issue concerning the repatriation of our industry, and how can we finally incentivize the industry in order to come back to Europe. And it is important to understand that we are facing, in a way, unfair competition, comparing with the way that China or the US are behaving on their own industry by giving them a kind of support that it's not even a blanket state aid, it is a direct state aid. In this regard, I think that it is important to establish as soon as possible the so-called border adjustment mechanism. It is of paramount importance, especially for the industry that it is involved in the cement sector, it is in aluminium, it is the non-ferrous metal or the steel sector. It is also important to understand that we have to protect our sovereignty by starting working on our value chain, on our value chain in terms of raw materials, on our value chain in terms of technology like hydrogen or CCS or CCU.
And that comes back nicely to what Laszlo was saying about the European interest in this, in a bold energy transition. But William, you wanted to come in.
Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to talk about the path dependence and saying actually a lot of these technologies build on each other. So as you develop carbon market, transportation and storage, that can incentivize blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen can incentivize green hydrogen. Green hydrogen can incentivize blue hydrogen. So I think when you start picking winners, sometimes you can lose the benefits of that path dependency. So if we say actually we just want to go down the green hydrogen route, you may push down the price of electrolyzers, which is fine and that's great and that's fantastic. But the unforeseen consequence may be that you slow hydrogen development on the demand side, and you also slow creating a carbon market and carbon transport and storage solutions and technologies. So that's why some of these integrated assessment models, they can pick up some of these interlinkages, especially around sort of build rates reducing the costs of some of these newer technologies. Yeah.
Laszlo, if you were giving advice to William, and I don't suggest this isn't a real piece of advice, but shouldn't BP going into electricity? I mean, if transport electrifies, if buildings electrify in their heating, because we do have ways of producing electricity that are emissions free, is this something that's going to really change the landscape, basically, electrification as opposed to the oil and gas?
So I actually used to be a strategy director of an oil company in my previous life. So I have a high degree of empathy and a lot of sympathy for the dilemmas that the major European oil and gas companies face, because I think it's fair to say that the European oil and gas industry, definitely including BP, is completely on board with the energy transition. But at the same time, they also face the dilemma that they have to judge how to use their existing skills. And if you look at, let's say, the traditional activities of an oil and gas company, you can start from, let's say, carbon capture and storage. That's basically drilling, reservoir management, pipeline operations. Very easy for an oil company. And in fact, oil companies play a leading role in carbon capture and storage globally. Geothermal power, again, drilling, reservoir management, very easy for an oil company. Chevron was actually quite active in geothermal power. Floating offshore wind. The oil and gas industry has 30 years experience building steel structures in water for their offshore operations. But then you move every day, and you get into activities like electricity supply, managing grids, which are technological fields that are quite far from the conventional core business of an oil and gas company. And there, the companies have to decide whether they try to develop those capabilities. Some of them do. So some of the major European oil companies are moving to electricity in quite consolidated fashion. Others try to do it. It's fairly usual in the industry to set up an internal venture capital fund. That they get active in those activities, but they realize that their management processes are a bit different and they have to treat those subsidiaries in a different fashion. And last but not least, you can very legitimately say, as an oil company, that this is very far from my core competence and I don't want to get into this area. So I don't want to tell oil companies where they should draw a line. This has to be a very detailed strategic deliberation. What I can see as now on the policy side, that what is a very, very positive phenomenon, that in the next couple of years, the major European oil and gas companies decisively came forward. And they can play an important role because it is absolutely true that the energy system will be much more electrified, but it's not going to be 100% electrified. Even in the electrified part, there are activities like offshore wind, where the skills and the project management capability of the major oil companies are incredibly useful. And in the non-electrified parts, either we talk about hydrogen. I mean, as of today, pretty much the only industry which is dealing with hydrogen in real life in large scale is the oil and gas industry, in refineries and petrochemicals operations. So either we discuss hydrogen, advanced biofuels for aviation, synthetic fuels for shipping, so many other solutions. I think the oil and gas companies can potentially play a very, very important role. And now that they are on board, with all their project management skills, technical know-how, and also capital strengths, I think they are very important allies for the European energy and climate strategy.
Yeah, great. Wow. Joanna, are there any questions coming in that sort of have to be asked in the few minutes we've got left?
So there is two questions that I think go together. One saying that the policymakers are always behind the curve, and how can we make sure that innovators work more closely with policymakers, such as professional engineering societies? And on the other hand, there's a question on the corporate side that the corporate strategy involves investing into offsets to decarbonize, but often it's chosen to purchase low-cost offsets. So how can we steer industry to decarbonize through research or new tech choices?
So, Maria, have you any thoughts on that on those questions? The policymakers are always behind the curve. That's kind of arguing for us not to do too much, isn't it?
I don't even listen to the question because, you know, sometimes there's a problem with the sound.
Sorry.
Well, in this application, but of course, the reality is this. But sometimes we are trying to follow the developments, and we are trying to fix the developments, and we're trying to fix the problems. You know, during the economic crisis, the EU needs more than 2 or 3 years in order to establish the European solidarity mechanism, the last resort mechanism, the IMS. But now we need just a few weeks in order to start discussing on how can we have the recovery fund, and how can we establish the recovery fund by issuing bonds. It is the first time in the European history, but the governments are discussing on how can we finally utilize the depth. So it is important to understand that sometimes lessons are learned, but it needs time, especially at the EU level. But I love to say that people must take their own responsibility, because you know, the implementation of policies is a matter of subsidiarity. And when we can do something at the local level, at the regional level, we do not do this at national level or at European level. So it is important to have people on board. It is important to start implementing our policies by engaging people.
And thank you very much. I do take away from this that building back better is an idea that wins our support. William mentioned it, and Laszlo has highlighted the potential benefits of the European Union, which doesn't have much fossil fuel itself in developing its low carbon economy. And I think we've more or less come out to the end of our time. So I've got to wrap up the conversation there. But thank you very much for having participated in this panel discussion. I hope people found it interesting. And I'm sorry we didn't have time to answer all of the questions that were put. Thank you also to the IOGP for its support for the webinar. We are intending to do another couple of seminars in this series about carbon management, but we have thought it best to have those webinars in September, when lots of things are going to happen. And indeed the 2030 target and all of this impact assessment modeling will be disclosed in September. So we thought in September, everyone will be focused again on the climate challenge. And so we'll have the remaining 2 webinars after the summer break. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank all of you speakers for having participated and your ideas. It's much appreciated. And see you in September to all those who've participated. Thank you very much indeed. And goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks.
Thank you.